Afghanistan in the 1970s was a nation governed by a monarchy under King Mohammad Zahir Shah, who had reigned since 1933. Zahir Shah's rule was marked by relative stability compared to neighboring countries, yet the state remained deeply hierarchical, with political power concentrated in the monarchy, military elites, and a limited bureaucratic class. The economy was largely agrarian, with approximately 80% of the population living in rural areas engaged in subsistence farming. Social and political structures were heavily influenced by tribal affiliations, local religious leaders, and ethnic divisions, including Pashtun, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, and smaller ethnic groups. These divisions shaped both governance and the capacity of the central state to impose reforms. Afghanistan's geographic terrain further complicates political centralization. The country's mountainous regions and remote rural areas limited the government's ability to exercise consistent authority, allowing local tribal leaders, known as maliks or khans, to maintain significant autonomy, particularly in rural districts. This decentralized power structure produced a situation where modernization efforts by the central government often clashed with entrenched tribal and religious practices. In 1973, Afghanistan experienced a major political transformation when Muhammad Daud Khan, the king's cousin, and former prime minister, overthrew Zahir Shah in a bloodless coup while the king was abroad in Italy for medical treatment. Daud established the Republic of Afghanistan and assumed the presidency. Unlike the monarchy, which maintained traditional ceremonial authority, Daud sought a more centralized and modernized state with greater executive control. His objectives included strengthening the national military, expanding economic infrastructure, and increasing relations with foreign powers, particularly the Soviet Union, which had become a significant regional actor. Daud's policies aimed to modernize agriculture, expand education, and increase urban development, including road networks and industrial projects. Yet these reforms were unevenly implemented. Rural communities, which formed the majority of the population, often saw little benefit from state programs. Daud's foreign policy emphasized a pragmatic balance between superpowers. While maintaining Afghanistan's official neutrality under the policy of non-alignment, he cultivated closer ties with the Soviet Union for economic and military assistance, obtaining arms, training, and technical advisors. At the same time, he attempted to engage Western countries in development projects and diplomatic support. This balancing act reflected Afghanistan's strategic location bordering the Soviet Union, Iran, Pakistan, and China, which made it a point of interest in broader Cold War geopolitics. However, Daud's alignment with the USSR, combined with his efforts to modernize the country, generated opposition from conservative tribal, religious, and rural elements. Many clerics and tribal leaders viewed his secular reforms and centralization of authority as an infringement on traditional power and social structures. Policies affecting land ownership, education, and women's social roles were particularly contentious in rural areas, where adherence to Islamic law and local customs was deeply entrenched. The political opposition to Daud's government took multiple forms. Among them, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, emerged as the most organized and ideologically motivated challenge. Founded in 1965, the PDPA was a Marxist-Leninist party inspired by Soviet communist ideology, advocating for radical social reform, land redistribution, women's emancipation, and the establishment of a one-party state. It was initially composed of intellectuals, students, and military officers, and it operated largely underground due to government surveillance and repression of leftist political activity. The PDPA's influence grew steadily during Dowd's presidency, particularly within the military and urban centers, where discontent with the slow pace of modernization, nepotism, and corruption created fertile ground for communist ideology. The PDPA itself was not a unified organization. It split into two main factions, the Khalq and the Parkam, early in the 1970s. The Khalq faction, meaning masses, was largely composed of Pashtun from rural backgrounds and emphasized revolutionary action and immediate social transformation. Khalq members held significant influence in the military and favored rapid collectivization and enforcement of radical reforms. The Parkam faction, meaning banner, was more moderate, composed of urban intellectuals and professionals, and advocated for a gradual approach to socialist reform, focusing on political alliances and broader administrative integration. These divisions within the PDPA, while primarily ideological, also reflected ethnic and regional differences and would later influence the internal dynamics of the government following the party's seizure of power. Dowd's efforts to suppress the PDPA and other leftist groups met with limited success. The government relied on military surveillance, arrests, and occasional purges of suspected communist sympathizers. However, these measures did not eliminate the party's influence within key institutions, particularly the armed forces, where PDPA-affiliated officers could plan clandestine operations. Internationally, the PDPA maintained connections with the Soviet Union, which provided ideological guidance, training, and material support to sympathetic factions. These external connections ensured that the PDPA could maintain organizational coherence and access to resources, despite government repression. At the same time, Afghanistan was facing significant socioeconomic challenges that undermined Dowd's authority. Rural poverty, limited access to education, and inadequate infrastructure contributed to discontent with central government policies. Tribal and ethnic rivalries compounded these challenges as local leaders resisted land reforms and modernization efforts that threatened traditional hierarchies. Urban centers, while more receptive to modernization, were small in scale relative to the overall population, meaning that the impact of economic and social policies was unevenly distributed. This created a dichotomy between the state's ambitions for modernization and the reality of limited administrative reach, fostering conditions for political radicalization. By the mid-1970s, Afghanistan was experiencing mounting political tension. Dowd's increasingly autocratic rule alienated both leftist and conservative elements. Former allies among the communist intelligentsia saw his consolidation of power as a betrayal of revolutionary principles, while traditional leaders viewed his reforms as an erosion of customary authority. Political violence and assassinations were limited but visible, signaling the fragility of the regime. The PDPA capitalized on this instability to organize clandestine networks, recruit sympathetic officers in the military, and develop a platform of radical change that positioned itself as the only viable alternative to both Dowd's republic and the conservative establishment. Throughout this period, Afghanistan's international position remained a critical factor. The Soviet Union, observing its southern neighbor, maintained a strategic interest in ensuring a friendly government. The USSR provided military aid, including small arms, light artillery, and advisory personnel, and engaged in training programs for Afghan officers sympathetic to communist ideology. Simultaneously, Pakistan monitored developments with concern, fearing instability along its western border. Iran, under the Shah, maintained limited diplomatic engagement, but internal political unrest and the eventual 1979 revolution further complicated regional calculations. These international dynamics reinforced the sense among PDPA leaders that external support could be leveraged in domestic political struggles, while also raising the stakes for any governmental collapse. By 1978, Afghanistan had become a nation at a crossroads. The monarchy had been replaced by a republic seeking modernization, yet central authority remained fragile. Radical movements, particularly the PDPA, were prepared to exploit political and social grievances. Tribal and religious opposition remained entrenched, particularly in rural areas, and the state's limited capacity to impose authority left vast portions of the country outside effective governance. Foreign powers, particularly the Soviet Union, maintained both interest and influence, creating an environment in which domestic political upheaval could trigger broader regional and international consequences. In April 1978, Afghanistan underwent a significant political transformation with the Saur Revolution, a coup orchestrated by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, that resulted in the assassination of President Mohammad Daoud Khan and the establishment of a communist government. The Saur Revolution, named after the second month of the Afghan calendar in which it occurred, was not the first attempt by the PDPA to assert political control, but it marked the first successful seizure of state power by a communist organization in Afghanistan. The PDPA's ascent to power reflected a combination of domestic dissatisfaction with Daoud's increasingly authoritarian government, internal factionalization within Afghanistan's political elite, and long-standing ideological preparation by the party since its founding in 1965. The PDPA had operated underground for more than a decade, recruiting primarily among students, urban intellectuals, and junior military officers, while maintaining clandestine support from the Soviet Union, which supplied ideological guidance, organizational training, and limited logistical assistance. The PDPA was divided into two primary factions, Khalq and Parkham, whose differences were ideological, ethnic, and social. The Khalq faction, meaning masses, largely drew support from rural Pashtun and emphasized rapid revolutionary change through mass mobilization and strict adherence to Marxist-Leninist principles. Khalq leaders favored immediate implementation of radical social and economic reforms, including land redistribution, suppression of traditional tribal hierarchies, and state intervention in religious and cultural practices. In contrast, the Parkham faction, meaning banner, was composed of urban intellectuals, government bureaucrats, and professional elites who advocated for a gradual, controlled introduction of socialist reforms, emphasizing coalition building, administrative consolidation, and pragmatic compromise with traditional authorities. Despite these differences, both factions shared a commitment to establishing a centralized communist state, reducing the influence of tribal and religious authorities, and aligning Afghanistan with the broader socialist bloc, particularly the Soviet Union. The PDPA's plan to overthrow Daoud involved leveraging its influence within the military, particularly among officers sympathetic to the Khalq faction. Several key army units, including elements of the Air Force and armored divisions, were infiltrated by PDPA members. These units were strategically positioned in Kabul and other urban centers to provide immediate control over government installations, communication networks, and critical transportation hubs. Coordination between military sympathizers and civilian party operatives was critical to the success of the operation, as Dowd's forces retained loyalty among other segments of the army, the intelligence services, and tribal militias aligned with the president. The timing of the coup was influenced by the perception of political opportunity. Dowd's consolidation of power had alienated both leftist intellectuals and former supporters within the military, and widespread dissatisfaction provided the necessary conditions for rapid mobilization. On the morning of April 27, 1978, the coup began with coordinated military movements in Kabul. Armored units and infantry loyal to the PDPA surrounded key government buildings, including the presidential palace, central ministries, and communications centers. Artillery and light armored vehicles were deployed to strategic intersections to prevent movement by forces loyal to Dowd. Simultaneously, PDPA operatives within government ministries and the security apparatus took control of internal communication channels, ensuring that orders from loyalist officers could be delayed or intercepted. President Dowd, despite prior intelligence warnings of increasing unrest among military units and political circles, remained in the palace and was ultimately unable to mobilize loyal forces effectively. After several hours of confrontation, Dowd and members of his family were killed, removing the last obstacle to full PDPA control. This operation established Nur Muhammad Taraki, a prominent Khalq leader, as the head of state and prime minister, formalizing the PDPA's control over the central government. Following the Saur Revolution, the PDPA immediately began implementing a series of radical reforms aimed at restructuring Afghanistan's political, economic, and social systems. One of the priorities was land redistribution, which sought to transfer ownership of large estates to landless peasants. The government issued decrees targeting landlords with holdings above a specified acreage, redistributing land to tenant farmers. This policy, intended to reduce economic inequality and undermine feudal structures, provoked immediate resistance from rural communities, particularly among Pashtun and Tajik tribes that had maintained control over agricultural resources for generations. In some regions, attempts to enforce land redistribution led to violent clashes, including the destruction of property and armed resistance by tribal militias. The rapid imposition of these policies demonstrated the PDPA's commitment to radical change, but also highlighted the limitations of centralized authority in a country with deeply entrenched local power structures. In addition to land reform, the PDPA pursued social modernization programs that directly challenged traditional norms. Education reforms aimed to expand literacy and access to schooling for both boys and girls, including in rural areas where literacy rates had historically been low. The government introduced mandatory education campaigns, established new schools, and mobilized teachers to implement state-approved curricula emphasizing secular and socialist principles. These reforms extended to women's rights, with initiatives to increase female participation in education and the workforce, prohibit forced marriages, and encourage women to participate in political and social activities. These measures were met with significant opposition from conservative elements, particularly in rural regions where religious leaders and tribal authorities viewed them as an attack on Islamic law and established social hierarchies. The government's enforcement of these policies relied heavily on the military and party cadres, further alienating local populations and creating conditions for organized resistance. Political consolidation was another priority for the PDPA. The party established a single-party state, outlawing opposition parties and creating a network of security services to monitor dissent. Internal purges targeted not only perceived remnants of the previous regime, but also rival factions within the PDPA itself. Taraki's administration, primarily influenced by the Khalq faction, carried out purges of Parkam members, senior bureaucrats, and military officers suspected of disloyalty. These purges included dismissals, arrests, and in some cases executions, consolidating Khalq dominance while simultaneously destabilizing the administrative capacity of the government. Despite the purge of Parkam elements, the faction remained influential, with Bubruk Karmal and other Parkam leaders maintaining networks capable of political mobilization, which would later play a significant role in Soviet calculations following the 1979 invasion. The PDPA government also moved to reduce the influence of religious authorities and traditional governance structures. Shuras, jirgas, and local councils, which had historically mediated disputes and administered local governance, were restructured or replaced with state-appointed officials aligned with party ideology. Religious leaders who opposed reforms or criticized the government were targeted through restrictions, arrests, and the closure of unapproved religious schools. While these measures strengthened central authority in urban centers, they provoked widespread resentment in rural areas, particularly among Pashtun tribal regions and ethnic minorities with strong local identities. This opposition laid the foundation for the insurgencies that would intensify in the following months and years. Internationally, the PDPA sought to align Afghanistan more closely with the Soviet Union, both politically and economically. Soviet advisors were granted increased access to ministries, military institutions, and state-owned enterprises. Economic agreements were signed to provide technical assistance, infrastructure development, and military equipment, reinforcing the PDPA's dependence on Moscow. While this alignment offered the new government security and resources, it further fueled perceptions among Afghan citizens that the regime was a Soviet client, exacerbating nationalist and anti-communist sentiment. Regional neighbors, particularly Pakistan and Iran, monitored the consolidation of communist power closely, concerned about the potential for political instability and cross-border insurgencies. By mid-1978, Afghanistan's political landscape had been fundamentally altered. The monarchy had been eliminated, a communist government dominated by the Khalq faction controlled Kabul, and radical reforms targeting land, education, and social norms had been initiated. While these policies reflected the PDPA's ideological commitments and Soviet guidance, they generated significant resistance in both urban and rural areas. Tribes, religious leaders, and remnants of the old political elite were increasingly mobilized in opposition, creating conditions for civil unrest and localized armed conflicts. These dynamics, coupled with the internal factionalism within the PDPA and the government's reliance on the Soviet Union for support, established an environment of sustained instability that would dominate Afghanistan's political trajectory in the following year. The Saur Revolution also altered the composition and priorities of Afghanistan's military. Officers and enlisted personnel were reassigned based on political loyalty rather than professional merit, with positions of influence increasingly occupied by party-affiliated personnel. The Air Force, Army, and paramilitary units were reorganized to implement government policy and suppress local resistance. Training programs were implemented to ensure ideological alignment, while Soviet advisors provided instruction on both administrative control and military strategy. These changes strengthened the PDPA's capacity to enforce its agenda, but simultaneously eroded cohesion among units with divided loyalties, creating vulnerabilities that insurgents would exploit in subsequent uprisings. Economically, the new regime embarked on ambitious programs intended to modernize agriculture, industry, and urban infrastructure. State-owned enterprises were expanded, and industrialization projects were launched in major cities. Agricultural cooperatives were established in theory to improve efficiency, though in practice, they were often met with resistance and logistical difficulties. The government's aggressive reform agenda, coupled with limited experience in managing a complex economy, and the disruption of social structures, produced uneven results, exacerbating regional disparities and further fueling opposition to the regime. The combination of radical reform, political purges, and centralized control created an environment of pervasive unrest. In rural districts, armed resistance began to emerge spontaneously among tribal groups and former landlords opposed to land redistribution. In urban areas, segments of the population resisted secularization and the curtailment of religious influence. These early signs of organized resistance, while initially localized, indicated that the PDPA's seizure of power had not secured long-term stability, and that the regime's reliance on coercion and Soviet support would be a critical factor in its survival. The Saur Revolution thus established a government that was ideologically committed, politically centralized, and militarily reorganized, yet profoundly unstable due to internal factionalism, rural opposition, and dependency on external support. The revolutionary changes of April 1978 were not only transformative in terms of governance, but also created the conditions for subsequent conflict, both within the PDPA and across Afghanistan. The stage was set for the emergence of insurgent movements, internal power struggles, and escalating tensions that would culminate in leadership crises and ultimately provide the Soviet Union with the pretext for direct intervention. Following the successful seizure of power by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, during the Saur Revolution in April 1978, Afghanistan entered a period of intense political instability marked by internal factionalism purges and a rapid succession of leadership changes. The PDPA, while unified in its ideological commitment to Marxism-Leninism, remained divided along the lines of its two principal factions, Khalq and Parkham. The Khalq faction, which held the primary influence after the revolution, was composed mainly of rural Pashtun and military officers who favored immediate and radical restructuring of Afghan society, including land redistribution, secularization, and the imposition of socialist policies. In contrast, the Parkham faction consisted largely of urban intellectuals, bureaucrats, and professionals who advocated for a more gradual approach to reform and sought to consolidate power through administrative and diplomatic channels. These internal divisions were a source of persistent tension within the government and the military, which in turn affected the stability of the new regime. Nur Muhammad Taraki, a leading figure of the Khalq faction, assumed the positions of President of the Revolutionary Council, Chairman of the Council of Ministers, and General Secretary of the PDPA. Taraki attempted to assert control over the country by implementing sweeping reforms aimed at transforming Afghanistan into a socialist state. Land redistribution programs were enforced across multiple provinces to transfer large landholdings to landless peasants. Simultaneously, state-led modernization campaigns sought to improve literacy rates, expand educational access for both males and females, and introduce secular legal codes that curtailed the authority of religious leaders. Despite the government's intentions, these reforms faced substantial resistance, particularly in rural areas, where tribal loyalties and Islamic traditions remained dominant. Landowners and tribal leaders opposed redistribution, while conservative clerics denounced the secularization of social and legal norms. The combination of ideological zeal, rapid policy implementation, and inadequate administrative capacity created conditions for widespread unrest. Internal purges further destabilized the political environment. Taraki's administration, dominated by Khalqists, systematically removed individuals perceived as threats, including parchamists and military officers suspected of disloyalty. These purges were often carried out under the supervision of Hafizullah Amin, a prominent Khalq leader who had rapidly ascended through party ranks due to his organizational skills, loyalty to Khalq ideology, and strategic placement within the military. Amin was appointed Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, positions that afforded him significant influence over both domestic governance and foreign relations. He played a key role in consolidating Khalq control over the government, coordinating the purges, and overseeing the enforcement of radical reforms. However, Amin's assertiveness and ambition generated tensions with Taraki, who remained the formal head of state. By mid-1979, the relationship between Taraki and Amin had deteriorated into an internal struggle for supremacy. Amin's aggressive approach to governance, combined with his independent decision-making, created friction with other senior officials, including members of the military and PDPA bureaucrats. Amin was increasingly perceived as unpredictable and willing to bypass established channels of authority, a factor that alarmed not only domestic actors, but also the Soviet Union. Soviet officials, who had long considered Afghanistan a strategic buffer state, were monitoring the situation closely. They were particularly concerned that Amin's assertive policies and tendency to act autonomously could destabilize the government, provoke widespread uprisings, and jeopardize Soviet interests in the region. In addition to internal factionalism, Afghanistan faced escalating insurgency in multiple provinces. Rural populations, particularly in the eastern and southern regions of the country, resisted government-imposed reforms, land redistribution policies, and secularization efforts. Armed groups began to emerge in the mountainous terrain, where Soviet-style military organization and centralized control were difficult to enforce. These insurgent groups, later known collectively as the Mujahideen, capitalized on local grievances and opposition to state authority, engaging in ambushes, sabotage, and small-scale engagements with government forces. The increasing frequency of uprisings highlighted the government's limited control over the countryside and reinforced perceptions within the PDPA leadership that decisive measures were necessary to maintain authority. In September 1979, the culmination of internal factional tensions led to a violent power struggle between Taraki and Amin. Amin, leveraging his position within the military and the security apparatus, orchestrated a coup against Taraki. On September 16, 1979, Nur Muhammad Taraki was overthrown, and within days, he was executed under circumstances that indicated both internal conspiracy and the use of state coercive instruments by Amin. Hafizullah Amin assumed the presidency, consolidating the roles of head of state, prime minister, and general secretary of the PDPA. This rapid transfer of power reflected Amin's ability to mobilize loyal elements within the military and bureaucracy while neutralizing political rivals. It also underscored the fragile nature of Afghan governance during this period, where authority was contingent upon personal networks, factional loyalty, and control over armed forces rather than established institutional legitimacy. Amin's consolidation of power was characterized by increased centralization of authority, a continuation of radical reforms, and intensified purges of perceived opponents. He maintained and expanded programs targeting land redistribution, literacy, and secularization, but the methods of implementation were increasingly coercive. Security forces, including the army, internal security units, and party militias, were employed to enforce compliance in urban and rural areas. Parkamists and other Khalq rivals perceived as threats were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. These actions further destabilized the administrative apparatus and contributed to a climate of fear among both bureaucrats and military officers. Amin's leadership style was characterized by rapid decision-making and limited consultation with other political actors, which reinforced perceptions of unpredictability and contributed to escalating tensions with the Soviet Union. Soviet concerns regarding Amin were both political and strategic. The USSR viewed Afghanistan as a critical buffer state along its southern frontier, bordering Iran and Pakistan. Maintaining a loyal communist government in Kabul was essential to Soviet security and regional influence. Amin's consolidation of power, while ensuring temporary internal stability, introduced elements of risk. He was seen as increasingly autonomous, untested in managing complex international relations, and potentially unpredictable in response to insurgent activity. Soviet officials feared that his actions could provoke widespread rebellion, undermine the PDPA's authority, and create openings for U.S. or regional influence. Internal Soviet intelligence reports highlighted Amin's consolidation as a potential threat to the broader objective of maintaining a reliable socialist ally in Afghanistan, setting the stage for discussions regarding intervention. During Amin's rule, the insurgency expanded in both intensity and geographic scope. Eastern provinces, particularly Nangarhar, Kunar, and Lagman, saw increasing guerrilla activity against government and military targets. In southern and western provinces, similar uprisings occurred in Herat, Kandahar, and Helmand, often coordinated by tribal networks resistant to land reform and state interference in local governance. Government responses relied heavily on the army and security forces, but the central government's limited capacity to operate effectively in mountainous terrain allowed insurgents to maintain control over large rural areas. These insurgent activities not only challenged Amin's domestic authority, but also justified the Soviet Union's monitoring of developments and considered intervention strategies to prevent the collapse of the communist state. Amin also sought to assert foreign policy independence, attempting to balance relations with the Soviet Union and other regional actors. While maintaining formal alignment with Moscow, he engaged in correspondence with Pakistan and the United States in efforts to secure international legitimacy and potential economic assistance. These overtures, perceived by the Soviets as attempts to assert autonomy and explore alternative alliances, heightened their concerns about Amin's reliability as a communist ally. The Soviet Politburo and intelligence services analyzed these developments in the context of Afghanistan's strategic significance, concluding that immediate intervention might be necessary to preserve both internal stability and Soviet influence. The internal dynamics of Amin's rise also had significant implications for the PDPA's organizational structure. Khalqists loyal to Amin occupied key positions in the military, the security apparatus, and state bureaucracy, ensuring that his authority was reinforced through control over coercive instruments of the state. Simultaneously, the purges of potential rivals, including Parchamists and moderate Khalqists, weakened alternative leadership channels and created an administrative vacuum in certain regions. The concentration of authority in Amin's hands allowed for swift decision-making but reduced institutional resilience, leaving the government vulnerable to both insurgent attacks and external intervention. By late 1979, Afghanistan under Hafizullah Amin was a state defined by centralized authority, radical reforms, and a fragile political equilibrium. Amin's consolidation of power had removed internal rivals and solidified his control over the central government and military forces. However, the combination of rapid policy implementation, reliance on coercion, insurgent resistance, and limited administrative capacity produced conditions of instability. The country remained divided along ethnic, tribal, and regional lines, with large areas beyond effective government control. The expansion of insurgent activity coupled with Amin's perceived unpredictability and efforts to assert foreign policy independence created a scenario in which the Soviet Union concluded that direct military intervention might be necessary to preserve the PDPA regime and maintain Afghanistan within its sphere of influence. Amin's rise to power thus marked a turning point in Afghanistan's political trajectory. While the PDPA had successfully seized state control and attempted to implement a socialist transformation, the internal factionalism, insurgent resistance, and international strategic pressures highlighted the limits of central authority. The consolidation of power by a single, assertive leader created both the opportunity for decisive governance and the conditions for conflict with domestic and international actors. This period of political turmoil set the stage for the Soviet Union's decision to intervene militarily in December 1979, framing Amin's rule as a critical juncture in the trajectory of the Afghan state and its role in the broader context of Cold War geopolitics. By mid-1979, Afghanistan under Hafizullah Amin had entered a period of political consolidation characterized by centralization of authority, intensified purges, and rapid implementation of socialist reforms. The radical measures, including land redistribution, secularization of education, and the suppression of religious authorities, were increasingly met with resistance in rural areas where traditional tribal hierarchies and Islamic practices remained deeply embedded. Simultaneously, insurgent activity was rising, particularly in provinces such as Nangarhar, Kunar, Herat, and Kandahar, where local communities organized armed opposition to state policies. These conditions generated alarm both within the Afghan political elite and in the Soviet Union, which regarded Afghanistan as a strategically vital state due to its location on the southern border of the USSR, adjacent to Iran and Pakistan. The combination of internal unrest, factional infighting within the PDPA, and Hafizullah Amin's assertive and independent governance prompted Moscow to undertake detailed assessments regarding the necessity and feasibility of military intervention. The Soviet Union's strategic interest in Afghanistan had deep roots in the geopolitical dynamics of the Cold War. The USSR viewed Afghanistan as a buffer zone that protected its southern frontier from potential threats and maintained influence over a region adjacent to oil-rich and strategically positioned states, including Iran and Pakistan. The Soviet Union had invested in Afghanistan through economic aid, military assistance, and political advisory programs, and the PDPA's rise to power in 1978 initially appeared to secure a friendly, ideologically aligned regime. However, by 1979, the Soviet leadership was increasingly concerned about Hafizullah Amin's leadership style and the broader stability of the Afghan state. Amin, despite his nominal alignment with Moscow, was perceived as unpredictable, prone to unilateral decisions, and willing to engage in foreign contacts outside Soviet oversight, including limited overtures to Pakistan and, indirectly, the United States. Soviet policymakers feared that such autonomy could destabilize the communist regime and create openings for Western influence in a region critical to Soviet strategic objectives. Soviet intelligence and diplomatic channels closely monitored developments in Kabul. Reports highlighted multiple factors that contributed to Moscow's concern. Amin's purges of the PDPA hierarchy, particularly targeting Parkhem faction members and moderate Khalqists, created both administrative disruption and the perception of instability within government institutions. These purges weakened governance capacity, eroded bureaucratic experience, and alienated segments of the military, which had been a key support base for the regime. The Soviet assessment concluded that Afghanistan's ability to maintain order and enforce socialist reforms without direct intervention was increasingly limited. Additionally, insurgent activity in rural areas threatened key transportation corridors and infrastructure projects supported by the USSR, including the development of roads, rail links, and energy distribution networks, heightening Moscow's perception of imminent crisis. The Soviet Union also faced concerns regarding Afghanistan's potential alignment with external powers. While Amin officially maintained a pro-Soviet stance, intelligence indicated that he was exploring diplomatic options beyond Moscow's purview. Reports suggested that Amin considered cultivating limited engagement with Pakistan and receiving Western economic aid, actions that the USSR interpreted as potentially undermining Soviet influence and threatening regional security. The geopolitical implications of an autonomous Afghan leader pursuing foreign alliances were significant. A shift toward U.S. or Pakistani influence in Kabul could destabilize southern Central Asia, compromise Soviet access to military and economic cooperation in the region, and diminish the credibility of the USSR as a guarantor of socialist regimes. Within the Soviet leadership, the Politburo and intelligence services conducted extensive deliberations regarding the appropriate response. Several scenarios were considered, ranging from limited advisory and economic support to direct military intervention. Military planners assessed the capacity of Afghan forces loyal to Amin to suppress insurgencies, maintain security in urban and rural areas, and enforce radical reforms. These assessments concluded that while Afghan forces were effective in some urban regions, they lacked the capability, organization, and discipline to control remote provinces, particularly in mountainous terrain where insurgent groups could operate with strategic advantage. The combination of domestic instability and insurgent pressure created a calculation that Amin's government could not reliably maintain power without external support. By late 1979, Soviet strategic planning shifted toward the possibility of direct intervention. Military advisors developed operational plans for the deployment of Soviet units to secure key locations in Kabul and other urban centers, neutralize opposition forces, and stabilize the PDPA government. These plans included precise instructions for targeting government buildings, securing airfields, and controlling communication networks. The goal was to ensure regime survival while minimizing disruption to the existing military and administrative apparatus. The Soviet leadership emphasized the need for rapid execution, operational secrecy, and the elimination of potential leadership threats that could compromise the stability of the PDPA. This planning phase, conducted over several months, reflected the seriousness with which Moscow regarded Afghanistan's political volatility and its determination to safeguard a socialist ally on its southern border. Economic considerations also influenced Soviet calculations. Afghanistan was a recipient of substantial Soviet aid, including weapons, technical advisors, and infrastructure support. The failure of the Afghan state to maintain stability threatened the security of these investments and risked a broader perception of the Soviet inability to protect allied governments. Additionally, ongoing insurgent activity disrupted agricultural production, energy supply, and transportation networks, threatening regional economic projects that relied on Afghan cooperation. Moscow determined that without decisive action, these economic and strategic risks could accumulate, undermining Soviet influence and credibility in the region. The international context further reinforced the Soviet case for intervention. Pakistan, under General Muhammad-ul Haq, following the 1977 coup, monitored developments in Afghanistan with concern, particularly about refugee flows and cross-border insurgent activity. Iran, still under the Shah in early 1979, but undergoing revolutionary upheaval later that year, represented another unpredictable variable. The Soviet Union was aware that instability in Afghanistan could spill across borders, potentially drawing in the United States, regional allies, or opposition movements. The assessment emphasized that allowing Afghanistan to descend into civil war or shift alignment away from Moscow could have significant repercussions for Cold War dynamics in South and Central Asia. Political debates within the Soviet Union centered on the necessity, timing, and scope of intervention. Some advisors advocated for a cautious approach, providing increased military and economic support to Amin's government without committing ground forces. Others argued that a failure to act decisively would result in the collapse of the PDPA, the empowerment of insurgent groups, and a permanent loss of Soviet influence. Intelligence reports reinforced the view that Amin's personal leadership style, combined with the administrative weaknesses of the PDPA and the strength of rural opposition, created a scenario in which indirect support might prove insufficient. The prevailing conclusion among senior Soviet officials was that only a targeted, well-coordinated military operation could ensure regime stability and secure Soviet strategic objectives. Preparations for intervention included logistical planning, troop mobilization, and coordination among multiple branches of the Soviet armed forces, including airborne divisions, special forces, and conventional army units. Operational plans, known internally as contingency measures, identified key targets, including the presidential palace, military installations, and critical communication hubs in Kabul. Security measures were taken to maintain secrecy and prevent premature exposure of the operation, reflecting the sensitivity of committing Soviet forces directly into a sovereign nation. In parallel, diplomatic efforts were conducted to monitor the reactions of regional powers and the international community, including potential responses from Pakistan, Iran, and the United States. In assessing the Afghan population's potential response, Soviet planners analyzed both urban and rural dynamics. Kabul and other cities contained segments of the population supportive of secular modernization and reform, particularly among the educated classes, but these groups were insufficient in number to stabilize the regime independently. Rural areas, home to the majority of the population, exhibited entrenched resistance to PDPA reforms, particularly in regions governed by tribal networks. Insurgent organizations were already establishing clandestine networks, acquiring weapons, and receiving logistical support from Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and other external actors. Soviet planners understood that intervention would not eliminate resistance immediately, and that operations would likely need to be sustained over an extended period to achieve the strategic objective of regime stabilization. Soviet strategic deliberations also considered the risks of international condemnation. Direct military intervention in Afghanistan could provoke criticism from the United Nations, Western governments, and regional actors. However, the leadership concluded that the imperative to preserve a socialist ally and secure the southern border outweighed potential diplomatic costs. Planning included measures to justify intervention as support for a legitimate government and the protection of allied socialist forces. These considerations informed both the timing of the operation and the selection of military units, emphasizing rapid action, limited initial exposure, and operational precision to achieve political and military objectives with minimal collateral escalation. By late November and early December 1979, Soviet decision-makers concluded that intervention was necessary. Hafizullah Amin's leadership, while consolidating power internally, remained unpredictable, and the ongoing insurgencies presented a growing threat to regime survival. Soviet intelligence assessments indicated that without direct action, Afghanistan faced the imminent risk of political collapse, widespread civil unrest, and the potential for increased influence by Western-aligned actors in the region. Operational plans were finalized, specifying troop deployment, command structures, and tactical objectives, with contingencies for both urban combat and control of strategic transportation routes. The pretext for intervention, framed internally by Soviet planners, rested on the argument that Amin's unpredictable leadership and the inability of the PDPA to maintain order justified the deployment of Soviet forces to safeguard Afghanistan's stability and preserve the socialist government. The planning phase also involved coordination with select Afghan military officers and PDPA loyalists who were aligned with the Soviet Union or receptive to guidance from Moscow. These actors provided intelligence, assisted in mapping critical infrastructure, and facilitated the identification of loyal units capable of supporting the operation. Soviet planners emphasized minimizing disruption to the civilian population while rapidly neutralizing leadership threats, ensuring the survival of a client government capable of implementing socialist reforms, and establishing a foundation for longer-term stabilization efforts in the face of insurgent opposition. By mid-December 1979, the operational framework for intervention was complete. Troop mobilizations, logistical deployments, and command assignments were finalized, setting the stage for the launch of Operation Storm. 333, the direct military action that would mark the Soviet Union's entry into Afghanistan. The pretext for intervention was therefore the culmination of a detailed assessment of political instability, insurgent activity, administrative weakness, and Hafizullah Amin's perceived unpredictability, all considered within the broader context of Soviet strategic interests in Central and South Asia. In the final days of December 1979, after months of strategic planning and internal deliberation, the Soviet Union executed a direct military intervention in Afghanistan, codified under the operational designation Operation Storm. 333. The operation marked the transition from political maneuvering and covert support to open military engagement. The Soviet leadership, having determined that Hafizullah Amin's rule was both unstable and potentially detrimental to Soviet regional interests, authorized the deployment of elite forces to neutralize Amin, secure key state structures, and install a more reliable leadership under Babruk Karmal of the Parkham faction. The intervention was predicated on detailed intelligence gathered over several months, including reconnaissance of Kabul, mapping of key government installations, assessment of loyalist and opposition forces, and coordination with Afghan officers deemed sympathetic to Soviet objectives. Operation Storm 333 commenced on the night of December 24 to 25, 1979, when Soviet units, including airborne troops, special forces from the KGB's Alpha Group and Spetsnaz, and conventional army units, infiltrated strategic points in Kabul. The operation targeted multiple locations simultaneously, focusing primarily on the presidential palace, where Amin resided, as well as military headquarters, communication centers, and critical government offices. The selection of December 24th was influenced by considerations of reduced civilian presence in central Kabul, potential disorientation among government security personnel, and the element of surprise. The execution relied on detailed coordination between airborne insertions, armored vehicle deployments, and internal intelligence provided by Afghan officers sympathetic to the Parkham faction. Operational security was strict, and measures were implemented to prevent early detection by either Afghan security forces or insurgent elements within the city. Hafizullah Amin, despite awareness of growing Soviet concern regarding his leadership, maintained the assumption that his consolidation of power and control over loyal military units would deter direct intervention. The Soviets, however, had determined that decisive action against Amin was necessary to prevent potential defection, further instability, or the escalation of insurgency that could threaten both the PDPA government and Soviet strategic objectives. The Soviet forces executed a rapid, multi-pronged approach to minimize the risk of protracted urban conflict. Elite units were tasked with breaching the palace, neutralizing Amin and key supporters, and securing control of communication networks to prevent the mobilization of loyalist units. Artillery and armored units were positioned to contain any resistance from nearby army installations, while airborne forces conducted precision operations to achieve leadership decapitation. The assault on the presidential palace involved a combination of surprise, precision, and overwhelming force. Soviet operatives utilized intelligence on palace security arrangements, patrol schedules, and internal layouts to navigate defenses and confront security personnel. Amin's personal guard, though trained and loyal, was unable to resist the concentrated and coordinated assault by highly trained Soviet special forces. The operation involved simultaneous strikes on multiple points, including entry gates, internal corridors, and command rooms, ensuring that resistance could not consolidate or effectively coordinate a defense. Casualties occurred among palace defenders and staff, but the operational plan minimized prolonged engagement, reflecting the emphasis on rapid neutralization of leadership rather than extensive combat with larger military units. Hafizullah Amin was killed during the operation. Sources indicate that Amin was located in his office within the palace when Soviet special forces engaged him directly. His death removed the principal obstacle to the installation of a pro-Soviet leadership and represented a symbolic demonstration of Soviet control over Afghan political dynamics. Following Amin's removal, Soviet units secured the palace complex, communication centers, and key governmental buildings, effectively controlling the administrative and political core of Kabul. The swift execution of Operation Storm 333 allowed the Soviets to prevent organized resistance within the capital, neutralizing elements of the military and security services that might have opposed the intervention. Concurrent with the palace operation, Soviet forces established control over central communication networks, including telephone exchanges, radio stations, and government broadcasting facilities. These measures ensured that announcements regarding the change in leadership could be controlled, disinformation could be countered, and remaining loyalist units could not coordinate a counter-coup. Military units loyal to Amin were isolated, and Parcham-aligned officers, previously marginalized during Kalk dominance, were integrated into command structures to facilitate the transfer of power and administration of the state apparatus. This coordination underscored the operational objective of maintaining a functioning government capable of implementing socialist reforms while ensuring allegiance to Moscow. In the immediate aftermath, the Soviet Union installed Bubrak Karmal as the new head of state. Karmal, a leading member of the Parcham faction previously exiled or marginalized, was viewed by Moscow as more reliable and compliant with Soviet guidance. His appointment represented a strategic recalibration of Afghan governance, shifting the balance from the radical Kalk faction toward the more moderate Parcham faction, which favored controlled reforms and administrative stability over ideological radicalism. Karmal's leadership provided the Soviet Union with a framework to implement longer-term stabilization policies, manage insurgency threats, and consolidate the PDPA government without relying solely on the volatile leadership style exemplified by Amin. Following the installation of Karmal, Soviet forces undertook measures to secure additional military and logistical assets. Key army bases, airfields, and transport routes were placed under direct Soviet control or supervised by Afghan units aligned with Moscow. The objective was to prevent insurgent exploitation of military resources and ensure the rapid mobility of forces to address potential uprisings. Soviet advisors previously limited to technical and operational guidance roles assumed a more direct role in strategic planning, training, and coordination with Afghan forces, effectively establishing a dual command structure in which operational decisions were influenced by both Afghan officials and Soviet military leadership. Operation Storm 333 also involved the deployment of airborne and armored units to the surrounding areas of Kabul to contain any potential resistance from peripheral districts. Intelligence indicated that pockets of Kalk loyalists, tribal militias, and insurgent groups might attempt to exploit the leadership transition. Containment measures included the establishment of checkpoints, control over major thoroughfares, and coordination with local security elements. Simultaneously, Soviet forces monitored key figures within the PDPA, ensuring that any potential rival claimants to power could be neutralized or co-opted into Karmal's administration. The operational focus remained on stabilizing Kabul and preserving the continuity of governance rather than pursuing an immediate campaign into rural insurgent regions, which were recognized as more complex and resistant to rapid control. Internationally, the intervention occurred with minimal prior notice to regional actors. Pakistan, which shared a porous border with Afghanistan, was immediately attentive to the implications of Soviet deployment. The United States and other Western governments, already engaged in Cold War dynamics, noted the action as a significant escalation of Soviet influence in South and Central Asia. However, at the operational level, the Soviet Union prioritized achieving control over Kabul and stabilizing the PDPA government before responding to diplomatic pressures or potential international backlash. The secrecy and speed of the operation allowed the Soviets to accomplish the primary objective of regime change and leadership replacement before significant external interference could materialize. The immediate tactical outcomes of Operation Storm 333 were clear. Hafizullah Amin was eliminated. The PDPA leadership was restructured under Babrak Karmal, and Soviet forces established direct control over Kabul and key government functions. These outcomes provided Moscow with the political and operational foundation to extend influence over Afghanistan while addressing internal factionalism that had previously undermined governance. The operation demonstrated the Soviet Union's capability to execute a rapid, precise, and high-risk intervention in a foreign state, utilizing a combination of elite special forces, airborne divisions, intelligence assets, and local collaborators to achieve strategic objectives. Following the initial invasion, the Soviet Union began to implement measures to consolidate control and stabilize the PDPA government. This included the coordination of security operations in urban areas, the deployment of advisors to provincial administrative centers, and the planning of subsequent military campaigns aimed at countering insurgent activity in the countryside. While Operation Storm 333 secured the central authority of the state and removed Amin as an immediate threat, the broader challenge of controlling Afghanistan's rural and mountainous regions remained. Soviet military planners were acutely aware that insurgent resistance would continue to escalate, particularly as anti-communist groups and tribal networks responded to the perception of foreign intervention and the continued enforcement of radical reforms. Operational evaluations emphasized that the success of Storm 333 relied on both precision and surprise, as prolonged engagement in Kabul could have provoked broader urban insurgency or encouraged defection among Afghan military units. The operation's effectiveness in neutralizing leadership and stabilizing the capital became the template for subsequent Soviet military strategies in Afghanistan, which would focus on maintaining secure zones, controlling critical infrastructure, and integrating Afghan government forces into operations under Soviet guidance. Ultimately, Operation Storm 333 represented a pivotal moment in the history of the Soviet-Afghan conflict. It marked the transition from indirect influence and advisory roles to direct military occupation. By removing Hafizullah Amin and installing Babrak Karmal, the Soviet Union sought to secure its strategic objectives, preserve a socialist ally, and create the conditions necessary for sustained governance and reform. However, while the operation achieved immediate tactical success, it also set the stage for a prolonged conflict, as insurgent resistance and rural opposition persisted, ultimately challenging Soviet ambitions and shaping the trajectory of the war over the subsequent decade. Following the successful execution of Operation Storm 333 in December 1979, the Soviet Union initiated the first phase of its military occupation of Afghanistan. The immediate objective of the occupation was to stabilize the government under Babruk Karmal, secure urban centers, and establish control over strategic infrastructure, while simultaneously addressing the insurgent threats that had persisted under Hafizullah Amin. The initial period of occupation, spanning from late 1979 into the early 1980s, was characterized by a combination of consolidation, administrative restructuring, and military operations aimed at asserting Soviet authority over both the PDPA apparatus and the broader Afghan state. Upon arrival in Kabul, Soviet forces undertook comprehensive measures to secure the capital. Units of airborne troops and mechanized infantry established checkpoints at key intersections, government buildings, and communication hubs. The central airport and major highways were placed under continuous surveillance, while military engineers reinforced infrastructure to prevent sabotage by potential insurgents. The Soviet command established a coordination framework with the Afghan Ministry of Defense, integrating loyalist elements of the Afghan army into operational planning. Provincial governors and local administrative officials were vetted for allegiance to the PDPA and, by extension, Soviet directives. This process ensured that Kabul, and to a lesser extent other urban centers such as Kandahar, Herat, and Jalalabad, remained under firm Soviet control during the critical initial months of occupation. The PDPA government under Babruk Karmal faced the dual challenge of implementing socialist reforms and securing legitimacy among a population deeply resistant to external influence and rapid societal change. Karmal, unlike his predecessor Hafizullah Amin, maintained a measured approach to governance, emphasizing administrative control, political consolidation, and collaboration with Soviet advisors. He sought to stabilize the internal dynamics of the PDPA by integrating moderate Khalqists, Parkamists, and loyalist military officers into leadership positions. This inclusion aimed to reduce factional conflict and present a unified front capable of administering both urban centers and peripheral provinces. Soviet advisors were heavily involved in shaping policy, monitoring internal party activities, and providing strategic guidance to ensure alignment with Moscow's objectives. Military operations during the early occupation focused on securing major cities and maintaining control over supply lines, communication networks, and key transport corridors. The mountainous terrain of Afghanistan presented significant challenges, as rural districts remained largely beyond the reach of conventional military operations. Soviet and Afghan forces established fortified positions along roads, river valleys, and mountain passes to prevent insurgent movement and to protect logistical routes. Air reconnaissance, artillery emplacements, and helicopter transport were employed extensively to compensate for the difficulty of terrain and to maintain rapid deployment capabilities. Despite these efforts, large areas of the countryside, particularly in eastern and southern provinces, remained under de facto insurgent control. The insurgency during the early occupation period was decentralized and highly adaptive. Tribal militias, village-based militias, and emerging Mujahideen groups leveraged local knowledge of terrain, mobility, and social networks to conduct guerrilla operations against both Afghan and Soviet forces. Common tactics included ambushes of convoys, sabotage of infrastructure, and targeted attacks on PDPA administrative personnel. The insurgents' ability to operate within dispersed networks allowed them to avoid confrontation with superior Soviet firepower while simultaneously undermining the perceived legitimacy and authority of the PDPA government. This insurgent strategy imposed a significant operational burden on Soviet forces, requiring continuous patrolling, counterinsurgency operations, and coordination with Afghan units to maintain urban security and protect key installations. The early years of occupation also involved efforts to extend socialist reforms to rural areas, though these efforts were limited by both insurgent activity and local resistance. Land redistribution programs, previously implemented under Kalkist leadership, were reinforced, and Soviet advisors provided technical assistance in agriculture, irrigation, and infrastructure development. Attempts to modernize rural education and promote literacy were initiated, often through the deployment of state-sponsored teachers and the establishment of schools in provincial centers. However, these programs faced substantial resistance, as tribal leaders and religious authorities viewed them as threats to traditional authority and social structures. The combination of resistance, logistical difficulties, and security concerns restricted the effectiveness of reform initiatives outside of urban and strategically important areas. The Soviet military presence was extensive and multifaceted. Units of the 40th Army, which formed the backbone of the occupation force, were deployed throughout urban centers and along key supply routes. Special forces and airborne units conducted reconnaissance, rapid response operations, and targeted strikes against identified insurgent concentrations. Coordination with Afghan army units, including loyalist elements of the 7th and 8th Divisions, provided additional manpower and local expertise, though loyalty and operational effectiveness varied across units. Soviet military doctrine emphasized combined arms operations, incorporating mechanized infantry, armored units, helicopter-borne troops, and artillery support to maintain operational superiority. However, conventional military tactics were often limited by the highly mobile and dispersed nature of insurgent forces operating in difficult terrain. Political stabilization during this period relied heavily on Soviet advisory involvement. Karmal's government, although nominally sovereign, functioned under continuous consultation with Soviet political and military advisors. These advisors oversaw administrative reforms, guided policy implementation, and monitored compliance with Moscow's strategic objectives. Provincial officials were expected to report regularly to central authorities, and coordination with Soviet representatives was essential for the allocation of resources, security planning, and enforcement of party directives. The integration of Soviet guidance into Afghan governance ensured that PDPA policies remained aligned with broader Soviet interests, but it also highlighted the limited autonomy of the Afghan state under occupation. The early occupation period also featured the construction and reinforcement of security infrastructure aimed at both counterinsurgency and regime consolidation. Checkpoints, fortified compounds, and observation posts were established along key transportation corridors, urban perimeters, and provincial centers. Soviet engineers assisted in the construction of barracks, military airfields, and logistical depots to facilitate rapid troop movements and sustain prolonged operations. Intelligence networks were expanded, incorporating both Afghan informants and Soviet operatives to monitor insurgent activities, tribal dynamics, and political developments. The comprehensive approach to urban and provincial security reflected the understanding that sustainable control required both physical dominance and effective monitoring of potential threats. Urban administration was further reinforced by the establishment of government-controlled information channels. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, and official communiques were used to communicate policy, coordinate administrative activities, and manage public perception. While these measures provided a degree of order within Kabul and other major cities, they were largely ineffective in rural areas where insurgent influence was strongest and traditional tribal networks dominated local governance. The limited penetration of state authority into the countryside underscored the inherent challenge of imposing centralized control over a geographically complex and socially heterogeneous country. Economic stabilization was another priority during the early years of occupation. The Soviet Union continued its provision of financial aid, technical assistance, and infrastructure support. Agricultural production, which had been disrupted by both previous PDPA reforms and insurgent activity, received attention through irrigation projects, provision of machinery, and technical training. Efforts were made to maintain key industrial and transport facilities, including roads, bridges, and power generation stations, to sustain both urban populations and military operations. Despite these measures, ongoing insurgent disruption, logistical difficulties, and the complex socio-political environment limited the effectiveness of economic and development initiatives beyond urban centers. Insurgent resistance during this period continued to grow in scale and sophistication. The Mujahideen leveraged cross-border sanctuaries in Pakistan and Iran, establishing supply lines for weapons, ammunition, and financial support. The use of small-scale, high-mobility tactics allowed insurgents to maintain pressure on Soviet and Afghan forces without engaging in protracted conventional battles. Soviet military planners recognized that while urban control could be maintained, the broader challenge of counterinsurgency would require sustained operations, adaptation to guerrilla tactics, and integration of Afghan forces into extended campaigns. The complexity of the conflict during this period indicated that occupation would not be a short-term endeavor and that protracted military engagement was likely. The relationship between the Soviet military and Afghan forces was characterized by both collaboration and tension. Afghan units provided critical knowledge of local terrain, tribal structures, and regional dynamics, yet their operational effectiveness was uneven. Soviet commanders often relied on Afghan forces for intelligence gathering, logistical support, and participation in joint operations, but issues of loyalty, training, and morale presented ongoing challenges. These dynamics required constant supervision, coordination, and intervention by Soviet advisors to ensure that operational objectives were achieved while minimizing the risk of defection or noncompliance. By the end of the early occupation period, the Soviet Union had successfully established control over major urban centers, secured key infrastructure, and ensured the installation of a pro-Soviet leadership under Bubrik Karmal. However, the occupation faced persistent challenges. Rural areas remained contested, insurgent activity continued to expand, and social and tribal resistance constrained the implementation of socialist reforms. The early years of Soviet presence thus represented a phase of consolidation rather than complete pacification, reflecting the complexity of imposing centralized control over Afghanistan's diverse and geographically fragmented society. Military, political, and economic measures were closely coordinated to maintain urban security, extend administrative authority, and prepare for the protracted campaigns that would define the subsequent years of occupation. By 1980, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan had entered a phase of sustained military engagement beyond the confines of urban centers. While Kabul and other major cities were under firm Soviet and PDPA control, the rural and mountainous regions of Afghanistan remained largely outside the reach of conventional forces. In these areas, resistance coalesced around the Mujahideen, a diverse coalition of tribal militias, Islamist fighters, and politically motivated groups united primarily by opposition to Soviet intervention and the PDPA government. The Mujahideen exploited the rugged terrain of eastern and southern Afghanistan, particularly the Hindu Kush mountains, river valleys, and dense forests, to conduct guerrilla operations against both Afghan and Soviet forces. These operations became the defining characteristic of the conflict, transforming it into a protracted insurgency that challenged the military superiority of the USSR. The Mujahideen were decentralized and heterogeneous, comprising a variety of factions with differing ideologies, leadership structures, and regional affiliations. Among the most significant groups were the Hezb-i Islami under Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Jamiat-i-Islami led by Burhanuddin Rabbani, and Harakat-e-Inqilab Islami under Muhammad Nabi Mohammadi. Each group operated with a degree of autonomy, but coordination occasionally occurred in regions of overlapping interest. These factions drew on historical tribal networks, religious legitimacy, and local grievances to mobilize fighters, gather intelligence, and sustain operations. Leadership often depended on personal authority, kinship ties, and religious credentials rather than formal military hierarchy, which allowed the Mujahideen to adapt rapidly to changing circumstances on the ground. Guerrilla tactics employed by the Mujahideen included ambushes on convoys, sabotage of bridges and roads, targeted attacks on PDPA personnel, and harassment of Soviet patrols. These tactics were highly effective in leveraging the geographic advantages of Afghanistan's terrain. Narrow mountain passes, dense forests, and limited infrastructure allowed small, mobile units to strike rapidly and withdraw before Soviet forces could mount a coordinated response. Soviet and Afghan units, trained for conventional warfare, faced difficulty adapting to these hit-and-run engagements, often sustaining casualties without being able to neutralize insurgent forces. The insurgency's decentralized nature meant that the loss of individual leaders or groups rarely disrupted broader operational capabilities, allowing resistance to persist despite Soviet efforts to eliminate key figures. The Mujahideen's capabilities were significantly enhanced by external support. Pakistan, under the direction of its Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI), became a primary conduit for weapons, training, and logistical assistance. Saudi Arabia provided financial backing to complement Pakistani operations, while the United States, through the Central Intelligence Agency's Operation Cyclone, supplied arms, training, and communications equipment to selected Mujahideen factions. China contributed limited military aid and logistical support, particularly in the form of light weaponry and training for anti-Soviet operations. The provision of advanced weapons, including recoilless rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and surface-to-air Stinger missiles beginning in the mid-1980s, altered the dynamics of the conflict by increasing the Mujahideen's ability to target Soviet helicopters and armored vehicles, thereby reducing Soviet operational dominance and inflicting material losses. Soviet military strategy during this period focused on suppressing insurgent activity through a combination of large-scale offensives, aerial bombardment, and population control measures. The Soviet 40th Army and Afghan government forces launched coordinated sweeps into insurgent-held territories, aiming to eliminate strongholds, destroy supply caches, and disrupt training and recruitment networks. Helicopter gunships, fixed-wing aircraft, and artillery were heavily utilized to target guerrilla positions in inaccessible terrain, often destroying villages suspected of harboring insurgents. Ground offensives relied on motorized infantry, mechanized units, and specialized reconnaissance teams to locate and engage small insurgent units. While these operations achieved localized tactical successes, they rarely produced long-term strategic outcomes due to the insurgency's mobility, adaptability, and the difficulty of sustaining control in contested rural regions. Significant battles during this period demonstrated both the effectiveness of guerrilla tactics and the challenges faced by the Soviet military. Operations such as the Siege of Jalalabad in 1980 to 1981, offensives in Kunar and Nuristan provinces, and repeated attempts to secure the Panjshir Valley illustrated the persistence and resilience of Mujahideen forces. In the Panjshir Valley, Ahmad Shah Massoud, leading the Jamiat-i-Islami faction, successfully repelled repeated Soviet offensives despite overwhelming numerical and technological superiority. Soviet forces encountered entrenched defensive positions, well-planned ambushes, and supply disruption campaigns, which forced them to adapt their approach and invest significant manpower and resources for limited territorial gains. The insurgency's use of terrain, local support networks, and mobility rendered conventional Soviet tactics less effective, highlighting the limitations of occupying forces against a determined guerrilla opponent. The interaction between Soviet forces and Afghan civilians during military operations was complex and multifaceted. In areas of active insurgency, the Soviet military often implemented population control measures, including the establishment of fortified villages, curfews, and restrictions on movement. These measures were intended to isolate insurgents from local support, control recruitment, and protect infrastructure from sabotage. Simultaneously, Soviet and PDPA forces attempted to extend social and economic programs into controlled areas, including agricultural development, road construction, and the provision of public services to gain civilian compliance. Despite these efforts, widespread resentment toward foreign occupation, coupled with cultural, religious, and tribal resistance, limited the effectiveness of such programs and sustained popular support for insurgent operations in rural regions. Soviet logistical operations were essential for maintaining prolonged campaigns in the field. Supply lines were established along major highways, fortified road networks, and temporary depots in strategically located towns. Air transport, including transport helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, enabled the rapid movement of troops, equipment, and supplies into remote regions inaccessible by road. These operations required constant security and coordination, as Mujahideen attacks on convoys, bridges, and supply caches threatened operational continuity. The logistical demands of sustaining large forces in a hostile and geographically challenging environment placed significant strain on Soviet military planning, highlighting the operational complexity of the occupation. The Mujahideen, in response, developed counter-logistical strategies aimed at disrupting Soviet supply lines and communications. Small-scale ambushes, sabotage of bridges, and targeting of convoys slowed Soviet advances and forced the redeployment of forces to secure transport routes. Additionally, insurgent groups employed intelligence networks within local communities to anticipate military movements and plan operations that maximized impact, while minimizing exposure. The combination of terrain knowledge, local support, and tactical innovation allowed insurgents to offset the technological and numerical superiority of Soviet forces, establishing a persistent operational stalemate in many regions. Internationally, the conflict drew attention and support from global actors invested in Cold War dynamics. The United States viewed the Mujahideen as a counterweight to Soviet expansion and provided training, equipment, and financial resources. Pakistan's involvement, coordinated through the ISI, was motivated both by strategic interests in controlling Afghan developments along its border and by concerns regarding refugee flows and internal stability. Saudi Arabia's financial contributions reflected an ideological alignment with Islamist resistance to Soviet-backed secularism, while China's support sought to counterbalance Soviet influence in the region. This international engagement transformed the conflict into a proxy war, with external funding, weapons, and training intensifying the scale and longevity of resistance against Soviet forces. By the mid-1980s, the insurgency had evolved into a protracted campaign that strained Soviet military capabilities. Despite superior firepower, advanced weaponry, and extensive personnel deployment, Soviet forces were unable to fully pacify rural regions or eradicate insurgent networks. Soviet estimates of casualties increased steadily, and operational effectiveness declined in the face of continuous guerrilla attacks. The Mujahideen's adaptation to Soviet tactics, coupled with ongoing external support, ensured that resistance remained resilient, effectively transforming Afghanistan into a theater of sustained irregular warfare rather than a conventional military engagement. The early years of sustained combat also revealed the limitations of Soviet counterinsurgency doctrine. Conventional tactics, designed for rapid engagement, territory control, and decisive battles, were frequently ineffective against highly mobile guerrilla forces operating within a supportive or neutral population. Soviet forces adjusted tactics by emphasizing search and destroy missions, fortified positions, and combined arms operations, but the adaptive strategies of insurgents continually mitigated these measures. The protracted nature of combat contributed to mounting personnel, logistical, and financial costs, creating pressures that would influence subsequent strategic decisions regarding the occupation. In addition to military engagements, the conflict had a significant impact on regional dynamics. Cross-border insurgent support from Pakistan and Iran facilitated the movement of personnel, weapons, and resources into Afghanistan, creating a continuous influx of reinforcements that sustained the resistance. The porous nature of the border region allowed Mujahideen groups to establish bases, train recruits, and conduct operations with relative security from Soviet forces. This external support network was critical to the insurgency's endurance and played a decisive role in shaping both tactical and strategic outcomes throughout the occupation. The cumulative effect of these dynamics during the period from 1980 to the mid-1980s was a prolonged stalemate characterized by urban control under Soviet and PDPA authority, persistent insurgent activity in rural and mountainous regions, and continuous adaptation by both sides to evolving operational challenges. Soviet forces maintained the appearance of political and administrative control through Bubrik Karmal's government, yet the inability to neutralize insurgent forces or extend authority into the countryside demonstrated the limits of occupation in a geographically complex, socially fragmented, and politically contested environment. By the end of this early resistance period, the war had solidified into a protracted conflict with clear operational patterns. The Mujahideen employed mobile terrain-focused guerrilla tactics supported by external resources. The Soviet military relied on large-scale offensives, aerial bombardment, and fortified control of urban centers and transportation corridors. And the Afghan state under Karmal functioned as a nominally independent but heavily supervised proxy administration. The interplay of these factors established the enduring characteristics of the Soviet-Afghan conflict, setting the stage for further escalation, increasing international involvement, and the intensification of both insurgent and counterinsurgent operations over the subsequent years. The Soviet invasion and subsequent occupation of Afghanistan had profound and immediate effects on the civilian population, shaping both the social and economic landscape of the country. By the early 1980s, large segments of the Afghan population found themselves directly or indirectly affected by ongoing military operations, insurgent activity, and the policies of the PDPA government under Bubrik Karmal. The intensity of the conflict, particularly in rural regions, created conditions that disrupted traditional patterns of life, challenged local governance structures, and precipitated one of the most significant humanitarian crises of the late 20th century. Civilian populations became caught between the demands of Soviet military operations, the enforcement of state authority by the PDPA, and the insurgent campaigns of the Mujahideen, each of which imposed unique pressures on communities. Casualty figures during the Soviet occupation were significant, with estimates of Afghan civilian deaths exceeding 1 million by the end of the conflict. These casualties resulted from direct military engagements, aerial bombardments, artillery strikes, targeted assassinations, and indiscriminate violence associated with both conventional and guerrilla warfare. Urban areas such as Kabul, Kandahar, and Herat experienced shelling and occasional urban combat, although the bulk of civilian casualties occurred in rural areas where Soviet offensives targeted insurgent strongholds. Villages suspected of harboring Mujahideen forces were subject to systematic searches, demolition of structures, and displacement of inhabitants. Mortality was compounded by inadequate access to medical services, the destruction of hospitals and clinics, and the interruption of supply chains for food, medicine, and other essentials. The war also produced a massive refugee crisis. By the mid-1980s, an estimated 5 million Afghans had fled the country, primarily to Pakistan and Iran. Refugee flows were concentrated in border regions, particularly the Pakistani provinces of Northwest Frontier and Baluchistan, where camps were established to accommodate displaced populations. Conditions in these camps were often difficult, with overcrowding, limited sanitation, and restricted access to health care. Despite international aid efforts, including assistance from the United Nations and non-governmental organizations, the rapid influx of refugees strained local resources and infrastructure, creating long-term challenges for both host countries and the displaced population. Internally displaced persons also represented a significant demographic shift, as families moved from conflict-affected areas to urban centers or regions under stronger Soviet or PDPA control, further stressing urban infrastructure and social services. Economic disruption was a pervasive consequence of the conflict. Agricultural production, historically the backbone of the Afghan economy, was severely affected by both active military operations and insurgent strategies. Landmines, destruction of irrigation channels, forced displacement, and the requisitioning of crops by occupying forces disrupted local food production. The targeting of livestock, fields, and village granaries by insurgent groups seeking to deny resources to Soviet and PDPA forces further exacerbated the decline in agricultural output. As a result, famine and food insecurity became common, particularly in isolated rural communities. Economic dislocation also affected urban areas, where inflation, shortages, and the destruction of transportation infrastructure limited access to basic goods and services. Social cohesion suffered under the combined pressures of military occupation, insurgency, and displacement. Traditional tribal and village structures, which had historically mediated conflict, maintained local governance, and regulated resource distribution, were severely disrupted. The presence of Soviet troops and PDPA officials introduced new authority structures that often conflicted with established norms. In areas under sustained insurgent control, parallel governance systems emerged, relying on religious authority, tribal leadership, and informal enforcement mechanisms. The fragmentation of governance and the disruption of social hierarchies contributed to a sense of insecurity, undermined local conflict resolution mechanisms, and increased vulnerability to exploitation by both occupying and insurgent forces. Health and public services were severely impacted. Hospitals, clinics, and other medical facilities were frequently targeted during military operations or became inaccessible due to insecurity. The availability of trained medical personnel was limited, as many professionals either fled the country or were displaced within Afghanistan. Epidemics of communicable diseases occurred, compounded by malnutrition and poor sanitation. Water and sanitation systems in urban and rural areas were damaged or destroyed during offensives, further increasing the risk of disease. Maternal and child health were particularly affected, with mortality rates rising in areas most affected by conflict and displacement. Education was disrupted at all levels. Schools were destroyed, closed, or repurposed for military use, and teachers and administrators often fled conflict zones. The PDPA government, in coordination with Soviet advisors, attempted to implement literacy campaigns and educational programs, particularly in urban centers. However, insurgent control of rural areas, ongoing military operations, and widespread displacement severely limited access to education for millions of children. The interruption of formal education contributed to long-term developmental challenges and restricted opportunities for socioeconomic advancement in affected populations. Women and children were disproportionately affected by the conflict. Women faced displacement, loss of family members, and the collapse of social support networks, which increased their vulnerability to poverty, violence, and exploitation. Children were frequently recruited, forcibly or voluntarily, into armed groups or were exposed to combat-related hazards, including landmines, unexploded ordnance, and shelling. The widespread disruption of family and community structures contributed to long-term psychological trauma. Although the social focus of this period was primarily on survival, displacement, and adaptation rather than formal recognition of mental health consequences. The humanitarian impact of the conflict extended to infrastructure, communications, and public services. Roads, bridges, and transportation networks were frequently targeted or damaged during military operations, limiting mobility for civilians and complicating the delivery of humanitarian aid. Electric power, water supply, and telecommunications infrastructure suffered damage or neglect, particularly in areas of active combat. Markets and trade networks were disrupted by insecurity, checkpoints, and border closures, contributing to shortages of essential commodities. These disruptions created a cycle of economic dependency on both Soviet support in controlled areas and external humanitarian assistance in refugee-hosting regions. International humanitarian organizations became heavily involved in response to the crisis. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, and various non-governmental organizations coordinated the delivery of food, medical supplies, shelter, and educational services to displaced populations. Aid efforts focused both on refugees in Pakistan and Iran and on internally displaced persons within Afghanistan, though access to many rural areas was constrained by security concerns and active combat zones. Despite these efforts, logistical challenges, security restrictions, and the scale of displacement limited the effectiveness of assistance and left large portions of the population in precarious conditions. The conflict also had long-term demographic effects. Migration, displacement, and mortality reshaped population distributions, concentrated populations in urban centers and border regions, and reduced population density in rural areas. This demographic shift altered social, economic, and political structures, reducing the influence of traditional rural authorities and creating new urban pressures related to housing, employment, and public services. The influx of refugees into neighboring countries influenced regional politics, international aid priorities, and Cold War dynamics, as both Pakistan and Iran became involved in the conflict through support to various insurgent factions and the management of refugee populations. Cultural and religious life was affected by the disruption of community structures and the imposition of both Soviet-backed socialist reforms and insurgent governance in different regions. Religious institutions faced restrictions in urban areas under PDPA control, while insurgent-controlled areas often maintained traditional religious practices but imposed their own social and religious codes. Cultural heritage sites, including historical buildings, religious shrines, and traditional marketplaces, were damaged or destroyed in areas affected by combat, artillery bombardment, or targeted military operations. These losses contributed to the erosion of cultural continuity and the destruction of historical memory within affected communities. By the mid-1980s, the humanitarian crisis was widely recognized internationally. Media coverage, reports from international organizations, and diplomatic briefings highlighted the scale of civilian suffering, the challenges of displacement, and the limitations of aid delivery. The conflict's impact on civilians became a central issue in discussions of Soviet military strategy, international response, and policy decisions, both in terms of humanitarian assistance and broader geopolitical considerations. Civilian suffering also reinforced the resolve of insurgent groups, who leveraged popular discontent to recruit fighters, mobilize communities, and justify resistance to Soviet and PDPA authority. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union faced mounting pressures that influenced the trajectory of its occupation of Afghanistan. Following nearly 6 years of continuous military engagement, the costs of sustaining operations became increasingly apparent across multiple dimensions: military, economic, and political. The Soviet military continued to control urban centers and key infrastructure, yet insurgent activity persisted in rural and mountainous regions, preventing the establishment of comprehensive authority. Casualty figures, although variably reported, had reached tens of thousands among Soviet personnel, with injuries and equipment losses further straining resources. These operational costs were compounded by logistical challenges in a geographically complex environment, where maintaining supply lines, troop rotations, and communication networks demanded constant attention and significant expenditure. Simultaneously, the internal political context within the Soviet Union was shifting. By 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev had assumed leadership of the Communist Party and introduced a series of reforms aimed at restructuring the Soviet economy, reducing military expenditure, and improving international relations. Gorbachev recognized the occupation of Afghanistan as a protracted and costly engagement that had limited strategic return and contributed to international condemnation. Soviet policymakers assessed that a continuation of direct military involvement risked further domestic economic strain, potential erosion of public support, and diplomatic isolation. These assessments influenced a gradual recalibration of Soviet strategy, moving from aggressive military escalation toward a controlled and phased withdrawal, while maintaining the appearance of support for the PDPA government. The political landscape in Afghanistan during this period remained fragile. Bubrak Karmal, installed by Soviet intervention in 1979, continued as president but faced persistent legitimacy challenges, factional tensions within the PDPA, and limited territorial control. Karmal's administration relied heavily on Soviet military and advisory support to sustain authority, manage governance, and implement development programs. However, the inability to extend effective control beyond urban centers and key transport routes constrained both governance and policy implementation. Internal factionalism, particularly between KALK and Parkim elements, continued to undermine party cohesion, complicating administrative decisions and contributing to political instability. Soviet leadership closely monitored these dynamics, understanding that the durability of a client government in Afghanistan was contingent upon both military presence and political cohesion. The Soviet Union began to formalize plans for withdrawal in the context of ongoing negotiations with regional and international actors. Diplomatic efforts included engagement with the United States, Pakistan, and Afghanistan's neighboring countries to establish a framework for disengagement. The negotiations culminated in the Geneva Accords of 1988, which provided the legal and operational basis for the phased withdrawal of Soviet forces. The accords stipulated conditions for the departure of foreign troops, guarantees for non-interference in Afghan internal affairs by external powers, and the provision for monitoring mechanisms to ensure compliance. These agreements reflected both the strategic necessity of exit for the Soviet Union and the international community's interest in stabilizing Afghanistan, limiting superpower confrontation, and addressing the humanitarian crisis resulting from the decade-long conflict. Implementation of the withdrawal was a complex logistical undertaking, requiring coordination across multiple military, political, and administrative layers. Soviet forces, numbering approximately 100,000 troops at the peak of the occupation, were systematically redeployed over the course of several months. Key operational tasks included the extraction of personnel, heavy equipment, and military material, the transfer or destruction of forward bases and fortifications, and the maintenance of security along withdrawal routes to prevent ambushes by insurgent forces. Air transport, mechanized convoys, and coordination with Afghan government forces were employed to facilitate the movement of troops while minimizing operational risk. The withdrawal process was further complicated by the need to preserve the operational capability of remaining Afghan forces, ensuring that Karmal's administration could retain a degree of authority during and after Soviet departure. The phased withdrawal officially commenced in 1988 and concluded by February 15, 1989, when the last Soviet troops crossed the border into Soviet territory. This exit represented the end of direct military occupation, but did not resolve the underlying conflict within Afghanistan. The PDPA government under Babrak Karmal and later Mohammad Najibullah remained in power, heavily reliant on continued Soviet financial, logistical, and military aid. The Afghan military, trained and equipped under Soviet supervision, continued to engage insurgent forces, yet faced ongoing challenges related to morale, operational effectiveness, and territorial control. Despite the absence of Soviet combat troops, the presence of advisors, continued material support, and intelligence coordination ensured that the Afghan government could resist insurgent advances for several years beyond the withdrawal. The immediate political outcomes of the withdrawal included the survival of the PDPA government, the continuation of the civil conflict, and the persistence of insurgent activity. The Mujahideen maintained control over significant portions of rural and border regions, using cross-border support from Pakistan and other sympathetic actors to continue operations. Urban centers, while relatively secure, required continued military vigilance, and the PDPA administration relied on internal security forces and remnants of the Afghan military to project authority. Political legitimacy remained limited, as the population's acceptance of the government was conditioned by coercion, dependency on Soviet aid, and strategic vulnerability in contested regions. The removal of Soviet forces shifted the balance of the conflict, creating a dynamic in which Afghan government forces faced insurgent opposition without the direct support of a foreign military power, while international actors continued to influence the outcome indirectly through material and logistical aid. The withdrawal also had significant implications for Soviet foreign policy and international relations. The decision to disengage from Afghanistan reflected a recognition of the limitations of military intervention in achieving long-term political objectives, particularly in geographically complex and politically fragmented states. Soviet policymakers analyzed the occupation's strategic outcomes, noting that initial objectives of stabilizing a pro-Soviet regime and extending influence over Afghanistan were only partially realized. The protracted conflict, high casualties, economic strain, and international condemnation highlighted the challenges of sustained intervention in an environment characterized by entrenched local resistance, external support for insurgents, and a politically diverse population. Lessons learned from the withdrawal informed subsequent Soviet foreign policy considerations, particularly regarding military engagements, regional influence, and the management of client states in politically unstable regions. Domestically, the withdrawal influenced public perception, economic policy, and military planning within the Soviet Union. The human and financial costs of the occupation had been widely reported, contributing to public awareness of the limitations of Soviet military power. Economic resources previously allocated to the occupation were redirected toward domestic priorities, infrastructure development, and the implementation of Gorbachev's broader reform agenda. Military doctrine underwent reassessment, with attention to the challenges of counterinsurgency, unconventional warfare, and the logistical demands of protracted operations in difficult terrain. The Afghan conflict thus served as both a practical and symbolic reference point in debates regarding the role of military force, the cost-benefit calculus of foreign intervention, and the limits of superpower influence in local conflicts. The Afghan withdrawal also affected regional stability and dynamics. Pakistan, as a primary conduit for Mujahideen support, maintained influence over insurgent operations and the post-withdrawal conflict environment. Iran, hosting large refugee populations and supporting specific Afghan factions, continued to play a role in regional geopolitics. India, China, and Gulf states also monitored the unfolding situation, balancing ideological considerations, strategic interests, and humanitarian concerns. The departure of Soviet forces did not reduce the intensity of conflict within Afghanistan. Instead, it created a power vacuum that intensified competition among insurgent factions and increased reliance on external support for sustaining military operations. The survival of the PDPA government under Mohammad Najibullah after the Soviet withdrawal demonstrated the extent to which institutional and material support from the USSR had buttressed the regime. Despite the loss of direct military presence, Najibullah leveraged intelligence services, internal security forces, and continued aid from Moscow to maintain control over urban centers and critical infrastructure. However, the absence of Soviet troops imposed constraints on operational flexibility, strategic reach, and political legitimacy, revealing the extent to which Afghan state authority had been dependent on foreign military presence. The government's continued survival until 1992 highlighted both the durability of state structures built with Soviet assistance and the limitations of externally imposed political legitimacy in the absence of local consensus. The Soviet withdrawal also had longer-term consequences for Cold War geopolitics. The protracted engagement in Afghanistan, combined with the eventual withdrawal, influenced international perceptions of Soviet power, revealed vulnerabilities in superpower military commitments, and affected the balance of influence in South Asia and the broader Middle East. The United States, having invested in the support of Mujahideen forces, considered the withdrawal a strategic success, reinforcing the efficacy of indirect engagement and proxy warfare. Other international actors reassessed regional strategies, evaluating the implications of superpower involvement, refugee flows, and the potential for instability to spill across borders. The conflict, including the withdrawal phase, contributed to the evolving dynamics of international relations in the late Cold War period, shaping policy decisions and strategic calculations beyond Afghanistan itself. The Soviet withdrawal also underscored the interaction between military strategy and domestic politics within a superpower context. Decisions regarding the pace, scale, and conditions of withdrawal were influenced not only by battlefield realities, but also by economic constraints, public opinion and political reforms initiated by Gorbachev. The ability to exit without immediate catastrophic collapse of the Allied government reflected careful planning, negotiation, and the leveraging of diplomatic mechanisms such as the Geneva Accords. The withdrawal thus represented both a military and political exercise in risk management, illustrating the complex interplay between operational capability, political objectives, and international diplomacy. By February 1989, when the last Soviet troops exited Afghanistan, the war had entered a new phase. The occupation's direct military component had concluded, but conflict and instability persisted, now framed around Afghan factions, regional support networks, and ongoing insurgent campaigns. The PDPA government's survival depended on continued assistance from the USSR, highlighting the enduring influence of external powers even in the absence of direct occupation. The withdrawal marked the end of a decade-long Soviet military engagement, representing a shift in both regional and global dynamics, and setting the stage for the next chapter in Afghanistan's protracted civil conflict. Following the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan on February 15, 1989, the country entered a period of continued conflict and political instability, the consequences of which reverberated across the region and the international system. The decade-long occupation had left Afghanistan with a fractured political landscape, devastated infrastructure, displaced populations, and a militarized society with entrenched insurgent networks. The PDPA government, initially under Babrak Karmal and subsequently under Mohammad Najibullah, retained nominal control over Kabul and several major urban centers. Relying heavily on the Afghan military, the National Intelligence Apparatus, KHAD, and sustained material support from the Soviet Union. However, the absence of Soviet combat troops fundamentally altered the dynamics of power, requiring the government to defend its legitimacy and territorial authority without direct foreign military intervention. The immediate post-withdrawal period was characterized by a continuation of civil conflict between the PDPA government and Mujahideen forces. The Mujahideen, still decentralized and regionally based, maintained control over much of the countryside and border regions. Their operations continued to rely on external assistance, particularly from Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and other sympathetic actors. Weapons, training, financial resources, and logistical support enabled insurgent groups to maintain combat effectiveness, disrupt government supply lines, and challenge the authority of the Afghan military. The continuation of armed conflict after Soviet withdrawal demonstrated the structural weaknesses of the PDPA state, including its dependence on foreign aid, limited local legitimacy, and inability to project authority beyond urban centers. Mohammad Najibullah, who assumed the presidency in 1986, implemented a strategy designed to stabilize the PDPA government in the absence of Soviet combat forces. This strategy included the continuation of military operations by the Afghan army, expansion of intelligence and internal security activities through KHAD, and selective engagement with regional actors to negotiate ceasefires or limit insurgent incursions. Najibullah also pursued a program of political restructuring, including the promotion of national reconciliation policies aimed at integrating moderate opposition figures into government structures, attempting to expand the government's support base and reduce reliance on military coercion. While these measures achieved limited success in consolidating control over certain regions, the broader insurgency remained resilient, underscoring the enduring challenge of governance in a context of prolonged conflict and external interference. The human and economic consequences of the war continued to shape Afghan society in the post-withdrawal period. Refugee flows into Pakistan and Iran persisted, with millions living in temporary camps under challenging conditions. Internally displaced populations faced ongoing insecurity, limited access to basic services, and disrupted livelihoods. Agricultural production, severely affected by years of conflict, remained below pre-war levels, and infrastructure reconstruction progressed slowly due to both security constraints and economic limitations. Health, education, and social services were unevenly restored, with urban centers often faring better than rural or insurgent-controlled regions. Landmines, unexploded ordnance, and the destruction of transport networks continued to impose risks to civilian life and economic activity, prolonging the humanitarian crisis initiated during the period of occupation. The conflict's continuation and the collapse of formal rural governance structures facilitated the rise of localized power centers, including warlords, tribal militias, and regional political factions. These actors often operated independently or in loose coalitions, exercising authority over territories based on military capacity, local alliances, and access to external resources. The fragmentation of political authority complicated attempts at national governance, reinforced patterns of conflict, and contributed to the emergence of a decentralized and militarized political landscape. The proliferation of armed actors increased both the intensity and duration of civil violence, complicating efforts at reconstruction and post-conflict stabilization. Internationally, the Soviet withdrawal reshaped regional and global geopolitical calculations. The occupation had already become a focal point of Cold War competition, with the United States and its allies supporting Mujahideen operations as part of a broader strategy to counter Soviet influence. The departure of Soviet forces was viewed as a strategic success for the United States and Pakistan, validating the proxy support model and demonstrating the limits of direct military intervention by superpowers in a resistant local environment. The conflict highlighted the ability of insurgent forces to sustain resistance through external support, terrain advantage, and decentralized operational structures, shaping military and foreign policy considerations for both Western and Eastern Bloc actors in subsequent years. The withdrawal also had profound implications for the Soviet Union itself. The occupation had imposed a substantial economic burden, diverting resources from domestic priorities and contributing to fiscal strain. Human costs, including tens of thousands of casualties and widespread injury among Soviet personnel, influenced public perception and eroded confidence in military engagements abroad. The Afghanistan conflict became a reference point for debates regarding the feasibility of projecting Soviet power, the limits of military intervention in complex political environments, and the broader strategic calculation of superpower engagement in distant regions. These factors, combined with internal economic and political pressures, contributed to the re-evaluation of Soviet foreign policy priorities and informed subsequent decisions in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. In Afghanistan, the decade-long conflict and subsequent continued civil war created conditions conducive to radicalization and the emergence of ideologically motivated groups. The Mujahideen's reliance on Islamic rhetoric and transnational support networks facilitated the spread of religiously framed militancy, influencing subsequent political developments. Training camps, weapons stockpiles, and logistical networks established during the conflict became enduring elements of regional security dynamics, affecting both immediate and long-term patterns of insurgency and governance. The military and organizational experience gained by insurgent groups during the Soviet occupation provided the foundation for subsequent armed movements and the eventual rise of the Taliban in the 1990s, who capitalized on the power vacuum, factional divisions, and public desire for stability after years of conflict. The political and military outcomes of the Soviet-Afghan conflict also had implications for Afghanistan's neighboring countries. Pakistan, as a primary supporter of Mujahideen operations, experienced both strategic and domestic consequences, including the management of large refugee populations, the proliferation of weapons and militant networks within its borders, and long-term engagement in Afghan political affairs. Iran, hosting predominantly Shia Afghan refugees, exerted influence through support to specific factions, while India and China monitored developments to protect strategic interests and assess regional stability. The continuation of conflict following Soviet withdrawal reinforced the centrality of Afghanistan in regional geopolitics, highlighting the interplay between domestic factionalism, external support, and transnational influence in shaping state outcomes. The withdrawal also demonstrated the limitations of conventional military power in addressing insurgency, particularly in a geographically and socially complex environment. The Soviet experience underscored the challenges of controlling population centers, securing rural areas, and establishing durable political legitimacy under conditions of local resistance, external support to adversaries, and decentralized opposition. Military superiority alone proved insufficient in the absence of broad-based political acceptance, effective governance structures, and sustainable economic and social programs. These lessons informed subsequent analyses of counterinsurgency strategy and shaped both academic and policy-oriented understanding of asymmetric warfare during the late 20th century. By the early 1990s, Afghanistan's conflict landscape had evolved further. The PDPA government, despite surviving the immediate post-withdrawal period, faced renewed pressure as insurgent factions consolidated, competed for territorial control, and leveraged external resources to sustain operations. The persistence of factionalism within Afghan politics, combined with the exhaustion of population centers and the destabilizing effects of protracted conflict, created conditions for the eventual collapse of Najibullah's government in 1992. This collapse marked the beginning of an extended period of civil war among Mujahideen factions, further fragmenting state authority and paving the way for emergent political movements, including the Taliban, whose consolidation of power would reshape Afghanistan's political, social, and security environment in subsequent years. The long-term historical significance of the Soviet-Afghan War is reflected in multiple dimensions. Militarily, it highlighted the challenges of intervention in asymmetric conflicts, the limitations of conventional forces in complex terrain, and the importance of local support and intelligence in sustaining operations. Politically, it demonstrated the vulnerabilities of externally imposed regimes, the importance of legitimacy in governance, and the consequences of protracted dependency on foreign military and financial support. Economically and socially, the conflict generated massive disruption, displacement, and infrastructural destruction, with enduring consequences for development, human capital, and population distribution. Regionally, The war influenced patterns of cross-border militancy, refugee flows, and foreign involvement, shaping South and Central Asian security dynamics for decades. Globally, the Soviet-Afghan conflict contributed to the broader narrative of Cold War competition, influencing superpower strategy, proxy conflicts, and perceptions of military effectiveness. The withdrawal demonstrated the potential limitations of interventionist policies in politically resistant environments, highlighting both the costs and strategic risks of sustained foreign military presence. The conflict became a reference point for subsequent international policy discussions regarding intervention, support to proxy forces, and the management of post-conflict reconstruction in politically fragmented states. The lessons derived from the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, particularly regarding asymmetric warfare, insurgent resilience, and the interplay between military, political, and social factors, remain integral to contemporary strategic and historical analyses. In summary, the aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal left Afghanistan in a condition of continued instability, with persistent conflict between the PDPA government and Mujahideen factions, ongoing humanitarian challenges, and evolving regional and international dynamics. The conflict shaped Afghanistan's political, social, and economic structures, influenced regional geopolitics, and provided enduring lessons on the limitations of foreign military intervention in complex, decentralized environments. The decade-long war, its immediate consequences, and the subsequent civil conflict contributed to the emergence of new political and militant movements, setting the stage for developments that would dominate Afghanistan's trajectory in the 1990s and beyond.